Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for once again coming before the committee, being willing to answer our questions. I want to just make a point about wages, and you don't need to comment on this. Almost 20% of the people in our country earn less, who are wage earners, earn less than $12.50 an hour. I don't know how many of you think you can live on $12.50 an hour, but I think given that you're working a 40-hour week, 32% earn between $12.50 and $20 an hour. $20 an hour is just barely $40,000 a year. And the next 30% is 20 to 30, much of it heavily weighted on the light end. In fact, I've seen one survey that has told us that 2/3 of all wage earners in this country earn less than $20 an hour, hourly wage earners. If you don't think that that presents economic challenges, if that doesn't change, we're wrong. I think that there is optimism. Optimism is leading to taking on more consumer debt. I think we're seeing that. The response, and I think appropriate, that you have on interest rates is going to drive increased costs. We look at, we've targeted or linked the student loan rate to what you do, thereby exacerbating those people who are attempting to take that next leap forward. So I just want to make the point that where your job is to look at macro, we visit with people every day in our states who are struggling to make ends meet. And I want to transition to the next place for me on North Dakota struggles, and that's trade. And you know, I've been asking questions about trade since for 2 years now. So if you look at the minutes of the Fed meeting, which I think Senator Toomey talked about, businesses across the country from steel and aluminum to farming have been telling Fed officials about plans to pull back their investments in their business or offshore their business. We have now pork producers talking about moving their pork production offshore to basically avoid what has been happening in the pork industry. These industries, I think, have good reason to be concerned. Economists across the spectrum, including economists in private sector, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, European Central Bank, the IMF, they're all raising alarms with trade tensions looming. So if the president's trade policies continue to result in escalating tariffs by our trading partners, I think this is going to have serious damage to the economy, and in particular to producers and consumers in my state. Now, just to give you a number, North Dakota is the 9th most dependent on imported steel. That surprises people, but you think about our base industry. What's one of the primary inputs in drilling and in moving oil? It's steel. What's one of the primary inputs in large equipment manufacturing? It's steel. And I have heard from my equipment manufacturers that what amount they got in tax savings has been gobbled up in the first 2-3 years of this fiscal, or 3 months of this fiscal year. So, and then we aren't even talking about farmers with the double whammy of getting hit with steel tariffs. They're large steel users, and seeing their commodity prices being challenged. So you offered a view last week that the president's trade war results in other countries actually lowering their trade barriers, then that would be a positive outcome. I don't disagree. However, the historic and economic evidence suggests the opposite is likely to occur. In fact, if you look at efforts such as Smoot-Hawley, we can go all the way back there, we know, and I believe, history will tell you that it contributed significantly to the depth of the Great Depression. I don't say it causes it, but it certainly did not assist in early recovery. So would you agree with former Chairman Ben Bernanke when he said in a 2007 speech on trade that restricting trade by imposing tariffs, quotas, or other barriers is exactly the wrong thing to do for the economy?
I would, assuming you're talking about them remaining in place over a sustained period of time, absolutely.
Well, you know, I get a little frustrated by this short-term pain for long-term gain. I think that we're going to have long-term consequences in agriculture because I think we're going to have emerging markets in a competitive space that we haven't before. We already see the Chinese are subsidizing their farmers to grow soybeans. We see that Brazil and Argentina are amping up their soybeans and arguably could be, in fact, buying American soybeans, marking them up, and enjoying our market with the markup as we struggle. So in that same speech, then Chair Bernanke cites studies which show that the effects of protectionist policies almost invariably lead to lower productivity in U.S. firms and lower living standards for U.S. consumers. Is there any reason to believe that these studies are no longer valid?
None that I know of.
Okay. Chair Powell, I make the point on Bernanke's comments and historic record because we can't afford to put our head in the sand and ignore the facts about the impact of the administration's trade policies on our economy. I think it's clear I've been probably one of the most outspoken critics of the president's trade policy here, certainly on this side of the aisle. And if we want to improve trade, the right way to do it is to expand trade agreements, in my opinion, not impose reciprocal tariffs. And so I am deeply concerned, and I know that at this point you are taking a watchful eye, but I am deeply concerned about the long-term ramifications of this so-called short-term policy. And certainly if we see the next tranche, the $200 billion, and then beyond that we see tariffs on automobiles, we will, in fact, be in a full-on, escalated, damaging trade war. And I don't know where that ends. And if this is a game of who blinks first, the best thing to do would be to get to the negotiating table. Now, I'm over my time. Yeah, I'm sorry. But I want to make the point that I'm going to stay on this. I'm going to stay on the macro effects of this trade policy because this is not good for our economy, and we are going to look back at this time perhaps in a year and say that's the point at which we turned the corner and the economy started taking a downturn.